The sheriff locks himself in a jail cell and locks the door from the inside. He throws the key with all his might to a place he can absolutely never reach. Staring at the desolate wasteland on the screen and at the cold body on the hillside, the sheriff is completely overcome with despair. His colleague, who came looking for him, sees what he's planning and desperately tries to talk him out of it, telling him not to do anything stupid. But the sheriff says it anyway, the very words that are an automatic death sentence. Hearing this, his colleague is heartbroken. But the sheriff, on the other hand, feels as if a 3-year-long constipation has suddenly been relieved. It's a feeling of pure release. You see, in the future, it's illegal for humans to go outside. Everyone has been relocated to this underground city called the Silo. For 100 years, no one has known who built the silo, and no one is sure why they're even here. All they know is that the air in the outside world is toxic. Anyone who goes out never comes back alive. So in here, you are forbidden from talking about going outside. Otherwise, you'll be exiled from the silo to die. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 9th Prince movie channel. Today, I'm bringing you the series Silo, a story about an apocalyptic bunker. In the first episode, we learned that because space in the city is extremely limited, to prevent overpopulation, every woman is required to have a birth control implant. Then, through a monthly lottery system, they can win the right to reproduce. As for the sheriff and his wife, after countless failed attempts, finally, one day 3 years ago, they won the grand prize, the VIP package, to have a baby, allowing his wife's implant to be removed. They were given 1 year to get pregnant, but unexpectedly, even though they were both perfectly healthy, 6 months went by with no signs of a pregnancy. Just as they were starting to lose all hope, a woman with white hair suddenly approached the wife, offering to help her. Allison found this a bit strange. Out of caution, she declined the offer. But she couldn't resist the white-haired woman's pestering, so a curious Allison decided to go with her and find out what was going on. After taking Allison back to her apartment, to prevent the Department of Judicial from eavesdropping on their conversation, the old woman first turned on the faucet. Then she told Allison that the higher-ups would never allow someone like her, a woman who was curious about the outside world, to have a child. Do you really think you're the kind of person they want having children? However, when Sheriff Holston heard about this from his wife, he comforted Allison, saying that the birth control implant inside her had already been removed. He said that, just like everyone else who was approved, they had the same chance to have a child. Besides, that old woman's mental state had always been a bit unstable, so the things she said were completely baseless. In the end, Allison was convinced by her husband. But a few days later, Allison suddenly received a last-minute repair request. When she walked into a computer repair shop in the Down Deep, the owner, George, pulled something down from a shelf. It was a paper that Allison had once posted on a local forum, an article about recovering deleted files. It turns out George had stumbled upon a hard drive from the old world. The strange thing was, the drive appeared to be empty. But George, following the methods Allison mentioned in her paper, discovered that most of its memory was actually being used. This suggested that the content stored on it had likely been hidden using some special method. And that's also why George went to Allison for help. After she successfully decrypted the contents of the hard drive, he stared in terror as he took off his glasses. Because what the hard drive contained was nothing less than the construction blueprints for the silo itself. For a historical relic like this, anyone found possessing it would be committing a serious crime. Before leaving the repair shop, she warned George, telling him to destroy the hard drive. However, after a long time of being unable to conceive, Allison couldn't help but think back to the old woman and the things she had said. So one day, she left work early and went back to the repair shop. As she carefully examined the contents of the hard drive again, she discovered that besides the blueprints for the silo, she could also see the world outside with its blue sky and white clouds. There were even birds flying in the sky. This completely shattered Allison's understanding of her world. That night, when she returned home, her and her husband Becker's license to conceive only had 7 hours remaining. They agreed to go to the hospital the next morning for one final check. But the next day, Sheriff Becker waited and waited, but his wife never came. When a worried Becker rushed back home, his wife, her face deathly pale, told him that the higher-ups would never let them have a child. Because she wasn't the kind of person they allowed to have children. After saying that, she held out her hand. In it was the birth control device that Allison had just carved out of her own body. Seeing his wife's blood-soaked palm and the kitchen knife covered in blood, Becker panicked and fled the apartment, running straight to the hospital to get help from a doctor. But before they could even get back to the sheriff's home, Allison had made her way to the silo's cafeteria, trying to tell the crowd there about the great deception of the higher-ups. She said that the world outside has green trees and blue skies, and that everything on the screen was nothing but a lie manufactured by the leaders to keep them all trapped here. By the time Becker heard the news and rushed over, Allison had already spoken the words that could not be taken back. "I want to go out." Then, Allison slowly held out her hands. Becker could only watch helplessly as his men placed handcuffs on his wife. You see, inside the silo, there's a rule that can never be broken. Any verbal request to leave the silo will be approved, and it is irrevocable. The leaders will ask the person who broke the rule to clean the ground-level observation equipment after they leave the silo, but they can't force them to do it, because once you've left the silo, you are no longer under its jurisdiction. Before leaving the silo, Allison apologized to her husband for what she had done. She also knew that the capsule inside her, which the doctor had claimed was a birth control device, was actually something else, meant to prevent infection. But none of that mattered now. She told her husband that she wouldn't die out there. The people in charge, they altered the image everyone sees on the screen. What they see isn't what it's really like outside. And although Allison didn't know why the higher-ups wanted to keep them all trapped here, she told her husband her plan. If the outside world is truly a wasteland, then she wouldn't clean. She would wave goodbye to the camera, because that would mean she had made the biggest mistake of her life. But if the outside was just as she had described, it was a lush and beautiful landscape. He would take out the wool, clean the sensor, and then walk over the hill. After figuring out the reason for all this, he would come back here and leave with Becker. When the time came, Allison put on the protective suit that had been prepared for her. Then, as her husband watched, she slowly walked into the airlock leading to the outside world. Before long, the residents gathered in the cafeteria saw on their screen a hatch open up on the surface. And then, Allison emerged from it. To Becker's surprise, his wife walked right up to the camera lens and cleaned the sensor with her wool cloth. This meant his wife's theory was correct. But before Allison could make it over the hill in the distance, the image of her on the screen began to weaken until she slowly collapsed beneath a dead tree. She had stopped breathing. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. As sheriff, Becker received a report from one of his deputies. A man named George had fallen to his death the night before. So far, there were no signs of foul play at the scene. But an engineer from the lower levels believed that George had been murdered. When they found this engineer, a woman named Juliet, she was in the middle of repairing the generator that powered the entire silo. After Juliet finished her work, the sheriff brought her to the crime scene and they examined George's injuries. But they didn't find any signs of a struggle. However, Juliet was still convinced that George would never have taken his own life. She told Becker that on the day George died, George had come to see her. They had agreed to meet in her room that night. But when she got back from her shift, even though Juliet didn't see George in her room, she found something he had left for her. Inside was a relic from the old world, and a note. It read, "Remember the last place you saw him." Afterwards, Juliet took Becker to the very bottom of the silo. She said that where she was taking him was a far more serious crime than possessing any relic. Much, much more serious. Then, at the end of the passage, Juliet moved a no-entry warning sign. An opening was hidden behind the sign. Following the passage behind the opening, they came to a gap in the floor. Using a simple ladder, they climbed all the way down. Once they reached the bottom, Juliet turned on the power. She switched on the lights, and what appeared before their eyes was the wreckage of a giant digging machine. Juliet guessed this was the machine the founders used to build the silo, and everything of value on it had long since been stripped away. Then they followed the stairs below the platform and reached Juliet's destination. This was a secret hideout that George had built. It was also the first place Juliet had seen the relic from the old world. But back then, inside the relic's box, there was also a roll of nylon cord, but now it was gone. Then, near where the box had been, Juliet found a trace of the nylon cord. Following the line, they went all the way to the end of a steel bar. And at the other end of the nylon cord, a package was tied. Inside was the very hard drive that George had previously asked Allison to help him crack. However, Becker, after taking this hard drive, never contacted Juliet again. Not long after, he locked himself in a cell and uttered those words from the beginning of the story. Once preparations were complete, Becker became the first sheriff in the silo's history to be sent out for a cleaning. Following the same path his wife had walked, Becker arrived on the surface, and what appeared before his eyes was the exact same landscape his wife had described to him. Then, the residents inside the silo watched as Becker slowly walked toward the sensor and used his wool cloth to wipe the grime off of it. But as he prepared to leave the area, the same thing that had happened to everyone before happened to Becker. But, unlike the others, Becker chose to take off his helmet. Unfortunately, this act only managed to relieve his symptoms for a moment. By the time he managed to crawl over to his wife's side, he had stopped breathing. Seeing this, Juliet went back down to the very bottom of the silo, to the home that George had built. Looking at the bed in front of her, she suddenly remembered a conversation they once had. George had told her that in the silo's blueprints he had discovered a secret tunnel hidden at the very bottom. And the reason George lived here was to find that tunnel. With this in mind, Juliet shouldered the rope George had prepared beforehand. After throwing the other end of the rope down, Juliet followed it, slowly making her way toward the absolute bottom of the silo. But when she reached the end of the rope, Juliet discovered that below her was a body of water of unknown depth. Juliet, who had followed the clues all the way here, after seeing the scene before her, she realized the silo seemed to be hiding a huge secret. Forced by the circumstances, Juliet had no choice but to temporarily give up her search for that mysterious passage. Hello everyone, welcome to Nine's Movie Exploration channel. Let's continue with part 2 of our silo recap. Back home, Juliet decided to rest before figuring out her next move. But not long after she arrived, her entire room suddenly began to shake violently. As a mechanic, Juliet quickly rushed down to the lower levels. She discovered the generator was malfunctioning. If it wasn't repaired in time, there was a high chance it would explode. But the only way to completely fix it was to shut down the generator first. However, ever since the silo was built, the generator had never been turned off. Now, without a sheriff, if the power went out for more than an hour, people would take the opportunity to cause trouble, possibly even starting a riot. Just as the higher-ups were at their wits' end, the entire silo shook violently again. Juliet couldn't worry about all that. She decisively entered the generator to perform a quick repair. After a lot of effort, she finally managed to stabilize the situation for the time being. At that moment, the mayor happened to be passing by. When he learned what happened, he was very impressed by Juliet's skills and immediately appointed her to take over from the old sheriff as the new sheriff. Juliet was completely stunned. A mechanic becoming the sheriff? That's just ridiculous. The mayor heard her and explained that it was the former sheriff, before he left the silo, who had specifically named her as his successor. As he spoke, he handed her the old sheriff's badge. Juliet took it and saw that the word truth was engraved on the back. This was a secret code she once shared with the old sheriff. Perhaps he really had discovered an important truth. To uncover the secrets of the silo, Juliet accepted the position of sheriff, but on one condition. She had to fix the generator first before she could leave mechanical. She was worried that after she left, no one would be able to keep the generator running properly. To do this, the silo had to shut down for a night. Although the mayor was concerned, he eventually agreed. He issued an announcement for an 8-hour blackout, reminding the residents to stay calm during the outage. As the blackout began, the silo was instantly plunged into darkness. The residents quickly gathered in the cafeteria, huddling together for warmth. But just 1 minute into the blackout, the screen showing the desolate surface suddenly flickered, revealing a lush, beautiful world. This immediately sparked confusion among the residents. Meanwhile, the deputies began their patrols in their designated areas, while Juliet and her team were taking apart the generator to fix it. They discovered that one of the turbine blades was severely damaged. It was grinding against the casing, sending sparks flying. Juliet and her apprentice used a harness to get to the damaged section. But just as they removed the blade, her apprentice's hands were shaking, and he accidentally dropped it. Luckily, it didn't hit any of the workers below. But just then, someone in the control room noticed that the geothermal steam pressure was higher than expected. The valve was about to burst. The situation was critical. Juliet had no choice but to leave the job of repairing the blade to her apprentice. She herself entered the valve opening right into the high-temperature steam and directed the control room to turn on the water jets to spray her down and keep her cool. But as the water level rose rapidly, it soon reached Juliet's chest. At the same time, the steam pressure kept building and the pipes began to fail. Just in the nick of time, her apprentice successfully installed the final blade. Once his apprentice was safely down, the man immediately opened the valve. Meanwhile, Juliet, with the help of her companions, was successfully rescued. And just like that, the generator roared back to life. The lights all across the silo flickered on. Everyone cheered, celebrating that the crisis was over. But in Juliet's mind, a dark shadow still lingered. As the mayor was signing Juliet's appointment papers, he suddenly felt unwell. He rushed to the bathroom, but the deputy sheriff soon heard a strange noise coming from inside. When he opened the door, he was horrified to find the mayor convulsing, having been suddenly struck down and killed. The Department of Judicial received the news and rushed to the scene. Faced with such a bizarre case, the deputy suspected the mayor had been poisoned. Just as they were all discussing the case, Juliet arrived at the station to report for duty. She never imagined her first day would begin with a murder case. The head of Judicial announced that, according to regulations, he would be taking over as temporary mayor. He then ordered Juliet to get to work immediately and assist in finding the killer. After they left, the deputy, desperate to avenge the mayor, completely lost his mind. He began grabbing anyone who looked suspicious, demanding to know where the poison came from. It turns out he and the mayor had been in a secret romantic relationship, but little did he know his own life was about to come to an end. That very night, as he was leaving work, he was ambushed and assassinated on his way home. He was killed instantly. By the time Juliet arrived, the head of Judicial had already had the scene cleared. He then appointed one of his own men, John, to take over the deputy's position. After the Judicial team left, Juliet found a slip of paper on the body. On it, a name was circled, Martin. Believing this could be the key to the case, she decided to investigate immediately. She starts by investigating Martin. The next day, a funeral is held in the orchard. To conserve land, the two of them are buried together. At the same time, a marathon is also organized, in an attempt to distract the residents. Meanwhile, Juliet has found Martin from the note. However, after questioning him, she learns that Martin suffers from a neurological syndrome. He can't even hold a pair of chopsticks steady. On top of that, he has an alibi, so there's no way he's the killer. Juliet then thinks of the other person on the list, Andy, who had previously clashed with the deputy sheriff. But when Juliet goes to find him, she discovers Andy isn't home, so Juliet secretly uses the pin from her badge to pick the lock. Sure enough, inside the room, she finds rat poison and a portrait of the mayor. These two items are all the proof needed to show that Andy is the killer. With the evidence looking solid, Juliet prepares to lie in wait, staking out the place for Andy to return. But just as she's leaving, she's spotted by a neighbor. The neighbor says that Andy moved out 3 months ago. Clearly someone is trying to frame Andy. So Juliet quickly finds Andy and hides him in a safe place. Then she goes back to watch the apartment from nearby. Sure enough, a man soon arrives looking for Andy, intending to set him up as the scapegoat. Seeing this, Juliet taunts him. Your attempt to frame him is pathetic. Didn't you know Andy moved out 3 months ago? Seeing that his plan has been exposed, the man takes off running, with Juliet in hot pursuit. But the marathon is in full swing, and the crowd makes it incredibly difficult for her to give chase. The man takes advantage of the chaos and suddenly doubles back to attack. He knocks Juliet over. Outside, on the silo staircase, Juliet desperately grabs the railing, her entire body dangling over the edge. Seeing this, the man relentlessly attacks, trying to push her off to her death. In the critical moment, Juliet bends the man's fingers back, creating a chance for her to escape. Fortunately, a few residents manage to pull her up just in time. Soon, Juliet discovers that the man who attacked her is a guard from Judicial. Meanwhile, the guard has already fled to a hidden room. After looking around to confirm no one followed him, he knocks on a door. And the one who opens it is none other than the head of Judicial. It turns out this whole thing was orchestrated by him from behind the scenes. He murdered the mayor and the deputy sheriff so he could install his own people and seize more power. Then, when the guard isn't paying attention, he pushes him down the silo, causing him to fall to his death. This not only silences the loose end, but also allows him to pin all the blame entirely on the guard. With no other options, Juliet asks Old White for 2 days off, determined to uncover the truth herself. In the cafeteria, she finds a man named Tom who is busy taking notes. Out of curiosity, Juliet walks over to ask him about it. Tom explains that he has been observing the sky outside the silo for a long time and has noticed that the stars seem to repeat the same trajectory. Although the silo has always claimed the outside world is unsurvivable, the man's discovery seems to prove that the window might just be a fake, a virtual screen. Hearing this, something seems to click for Juliet. She goes back to her meeting spot with George, takes the toy out of the metal box, and begins to think. She suspects the toy must contain some important information, so she brings it back to the station, intending to look it up in the database. Because for a historical object like this, there should be corresponding information in the database. She realized she didn't have the clearance, only Judicial could run the check. But if she handed it over to Judicial directly, the serious crime of illegally possessing a historical artifact would be exposed. So, Juliet came up with a plan. While searching the guard's apartment, she secretly planted the artifact in his cabinet and then had her deputy discover it. This way, she could get Judicial to investigate the artifact's purpose. Afterwards, Juliet and her deputy went to Judicial. She presented the artifact, stating that it was found in the guard's apartment, and she wanted to request clearance to investigate it. However, Sims declared that this was a matter for him to investigate. After all, the dead guard was one of his men. After hearing this, Judge Meadows agreed that Sims had a point and let him take over the investigation. Juliet was about to argue with Sims, but he ordered her to investigate residents who were trading historical artifacts instead. He wanted her to draw up a list of their names. The lead she had worked so hard to get was cut off just like that, but she was helpless. Judicial was above the sheriff's department, so Juliet had no choice but to obey. To find a new lead, Juliet decided to ask Andy, who had a criminal record. Even though Andy had been clean for many years, she was sure he still knew who else was dealing in artifacts. At first, Andy didn't want to sell out his former partners, but to repay Juliet for saving his life, he gave up the name of a woman called Bryony. However, when Juliet found Bryony, she discovered this was George's ex-girlfriend. It was after they broke up that George transferred to Mechanical, which is when he met Juliet, but Bryony had no idea that George had fallen to his death. When she found out George was dead, she was surprisingly calm. It was because she hated George. It was George's artifact dealing that led to her family being arrested by Judicial. But since he'd already cut ties with George, he naturally had nothing to do with the historical artifacts anymore. After hearing this, Juliet decided to leave, but her deputy was suspicious. He believed that Bernard must still have a historical artifact, and that they should search him. Juliet didn't respond, because she realized that George's death had to be connected to Bernard. So she had to ditch her deputy and investigate on her own. That night, Juliet found Bernard again. Under questioning, Bernard confessed that a mysterious person, threatening his family's lives, had forced him to name the person dealing in historical artifacts. Terrified, he gave up George's name, which ultimately led to his fall from the stairs. And this mysterious person seemed to know his every move. Everything he said and everyone he saw, this mysterious person knew it all. Bernard was terrified. That's why he installed so many soundproof panels in his home. But even so, Juliet had no intention of sympathizing with him. After all, George died because Bernard snitched on him. But Bernard explained that George fell to his death because of a hard drive. As for what was on the hard drive, he didn't know. In the end, Bernard took a bag that George had left behind and gave it to Juliet, and he warned her to never, ever tell anyone. Back at home, Juliet opened the bag and found a magazine inside. The magazine documented the beautiful world outside. There were lush forests, crystal clear rivers, and images of animals living in their habitats. This was completely different from the apocalyptic world described in the silo. Juliet began to question everything. Who was hiding the truth? And what was their purpose? However, what Juliet didn't know was that her every single move was already being watched. Seeing that Juliet was gathering more and more clues, the villains wanted to make their move, but suddenly, the bald man appeared. He said now wasn't the time. Meanwhile, Juliet, using information from the magazine, discovered a name, Nichols, that was highly suspicious. This was because in George's file, the name Nichols had also appeared. But when Juliet followed the clues to find him, she discovered Nichols wasn't lucid. It seemed he had been injected with some kind of drug. A nurse also revealed that it was Judicial who had him locked up here. So, the next day, Juliet went to see the judge in the black robes to ask why, but she was warned not to cross the silo's red lines and was ordered to stop her investigation immediately. Faced with pressure from the judge, Juliet didn't give up. She asked her father, who works at the hospital, for help. The plan was to use her father's connections to get into the hospital and then meet with Nichols alone. Although it was illegal, faced with his daughter's plea, her father had no choice but to agree. So, Juliet took Nichols to a surveillance blind spot and asked him about the magazine and about George, but Nichols didn't respond at all. Seeing this, her father quickly mixed a drug to counteract the sedative, which gradually brought Nichols back to consciousness. However, when Nichols saw Juliet's father, he instantly became extremely agitated, because her father was the surgeon who performed the operation that prevented him from having children. To calm Nichols down, Juliet had her father step outside. She then took out the magazine and handed it to him. Upon seeing the magazine, Nichols' memories instantly came flooding back. It turns out the magazine was left by George's family. Both Nichols and George's family were members of the old rebel group, the Flame Keepers. The Flame Keepers firmly believed that the outside world was safe, but the silo's leaders were controlling them, and they were forbidden from having children. This caused the Flame Keepers to gradually die out. At this point, Nico was the last Flame Keeper. So, Nico passed the title of Flame Keeper on to Juliet. But after hearing all this, Juliet was completely baffled. Nico explained that the Flame Keepers had always tried to tell the world the truth, but the silo's leadership was constantly trying to erase everything related to it. That's why they wanted all the Flame Keepers eliminated. After hearing this, Juliet was utterly shocked. She went to confront her father, asking why he worked for the silo. Her father helplessly explained that back then doctors were forbidden from removing the Flame Keeper's birth control devices, and he had no choice but to obey. Hearing this, Juliet knew she couldn't blame her father, so she took Nico back to his hospital room. As she was leaving, Nico remembered that the Black Sheriff from the beginning had visited him and placed some flowers on the cabinet. Juliet immediately realized that there might be a camera installed behind the mirror. So she covered the mirror with a blanket and inside the ventilation duct found a hard drive containing the silo's secrets. Meanwhile, Baldy saw that the surveillance feed in Nico's room was down and sent his men to the hospital to check on the situation. However, when the security team arrived, Juliet cleverly hid in the nursery and managed to escape. At the same time, Baldy went to Nico's room and demanded to know what Juliet took from the vent. When Nico refused to answer, Baldy threatened to use drugs to torture him to death. Left with no choice, Nico revealed the location of the hard drive. Just then, Juliet rushed back to the station, only to find that people from Judicial had already torn the place apart. Her deputy told her it was Baldy who sent people to search for historical relics, but it was obvious they were looking for the hard drive. Although the agents from Judicial searched Juliet's bag, they came up empty. That's because Juliet had already hidden the hard drive. Seeing that their search was fruitless, Judicial had no choice but to leave. When Baldy learned his men couldn't find the drive, he flew into a rage. Just then, Juliet burst in and said Baldy had violated the pact by searching the sheriff's station without authorization. She ordered her deputies to arrest him. However, as he was being led away, Baldy warned Juliet, "You better watch your back." Juliet paid him no mind, but little did she know Baldy would be released almost immediately. Juliet quickly went to her father's office. Turns out, there were no surveillance cameras there. That's why she'd hidden the hard drive under the crib. She had intended to use her father's computer to see what was on the drive, but she found out it was encrypted. So Juliet decided to find a computer expert to help her. But who would have thought, on her way there, she ran into a Judicial checkpoint. Even though she flashed her sheriff's badge, they still refused to let her pass. At that critical moment, the new mayor, Holland, appeared. He used his authority as mayor to help Juliet get past the inspection. Juliet thought the mayor was definitely someone she could trust, so she told Holland everything she had found. She said that Baldy was plotting something big, probably trying to seize control of the silo, but that he had a mastermind behind him. She just didn't know who it was. After hearing this, Holland quickly suggested they go somewhere else to talk. He led Juliet to a deserted field in the farm levels. As they were talking, Holland casually mentioned the hard drive. Juliet instantly grew suspicious. She realized Holland and Baldy were working together, because she had never mentioned a hard drive to Holland. Holland, seeing that he'd given himself away, so he dropped the act and whistled into the air. And just like that, the bald agent appeared behind Juliet. It was only then that Juliet finally understood Bernard was the true mastermind. Then, Bernard falsely accused Juliet of saying the words, "I want to go out," wanting to have her sent outside the silo. With no time to think, Juliet broke into a run, but the place was crawling with agents from Judicial. It wasn't long before she was captured. Bald Agent took the hard drive from her bag and sent her to the holding cells. However, while being escorted, Juliet seized an opportunity, managed to snatch the hard drive, and then climbed onto the railing of the silo's main staircase. And then, to everyone's utter shock, she took a leap. She jumped. Luckily, the platform below wasn't too far down, and Juliet survived the fall. By the time the bald agent got down there, Juliet had already vanished. When Bernard learned of Juliet's escape, he was furious. He was worried the contents of the drive would be exposed and cause chaos. So he ordered the bald agent to conduct a silo-wide manhunt for anyone connected to Juliet. No one was to be spared. But even after they turned the silo upside down, they couldn't find a single trace of her. As it turns out, Juliet was hiding in the safest place imaginable, which was the bald agent's own home. Juliet used police-issued handcuffs to cuff his wife Susan to the wall. Then she removed anything that could be used as a weapon. The reason Juliet was being so cautious was because Susan was a former security chief and a formidable fighter. Next, Juliet plugged the drive into the bald agent's computer. She quickly found a file named George. When she opened it, she found a video that George had recorded before he died. In the video, George said, "No matter who you are, if you're watching this video, I need you to tell everyone the truth about the outside world." Juliet was completely mesmerized, failing to notice that Susan had already picked the lock on her cuffs and was sneaking up behind her with a hammer. Meanwhile, Mayor Bai, also using technical means, located where the hard drive was being accessed. Baldy took one look and, "Oh my god, isn't that my house?" So he rushed home with his men, only to find Susan sitting safely on the bed, holding their child. But Juliet was nowhere to be found. When Mayor Bai found out, he immediately ordered a lockdown of the silo, forbidding anyone from leaving their area. But a young man claiming to be from the IT department refused to listen. He said he needed to help a resident fix their computer and that it was an emergency. The security guard didn't like the look of him, but let him pass. Once downstairs, he knocked on Andy's door, and Juliet was in fact hiding in Andy's home. Juliet had saved Andy's life once, so he was willing to give her shelter. He had also called the young man over to help crack the hard drive, and the guy didn't disappoint. Not only did he successfully crack it, but he also changed the computer's address to prevent Judicial from tracking the drive's location again. This also bought Juliet more time to go through the drive's contents. Playing George's video again, she heard him mention that in the pool of water at the very bottom of the silo, there's a door. If you can just open that door, you'll find out the entire truth. There was also a video of the outside. It showed blue skies and white clouds, a clear, beautiful day with fragrant grass, the sounds of birds and the smell of flowers, the exact opposite of the apocalypse the silo's leaders preached. It was completely different. Juliet decided to broadcast the video from the drive to every computer in the silo. She wanted all the residents to see the real world outside. The young man said they'd have to get to the main server on level 126 to be able to do that. So the three of them rushed towards level 126. But by now, the path was blocked by Judicial. Under heavy surveillance, Juliet decides to use the garbage chute. The chute is dangerous, but it connects to all the floors. After the three of them make it, they successfully connect the hard drive to the main server. With a few clicks, they broadcast the video's content to every screen in the silo. The sight instantly shocks everyone. Seeing this, Bernard immediately shuts down the system and warns everyone in the control room to forget everything they just saw. Meanwhile, the system on Juliet's end is also shut down. Realizing they've been discovered, the three of them decide to split up and run. However, the young man and the others are quickly caught by Bernard's men. Only Juliet is nowhere to be seen. Bernard figures Juliet is most likely hiding in the garbage chute, so he orders his men to check it out. Sure enough, his men find Juliet in the chute and try to convince her to come back up, telling her it's far too dangerous in there. But Juliet ignores them and just keeps climbing down. Sims arrives, smug and wasting no time. He immediately orders his men to bring over a huge metal container, planning to crush Juliet with it. With nowhere left to run, Juliet is forced to let go and fall. An instant later, the massive container comes crashing down after her. But then, Mayor Bernard and Sims quickly arrive on the scene. Not only have they captured Juliet, they also smash the hard drive to bits with a hammer. Bernard demands that Juliet say the words, "I want to go outside," and give up her position as sheriff. Otherwise, the people who helped her will meet a tragic end. To protect her friends, Juliet has no choice but to agree. But she has one condition. She wants to know who killed her boyfriend, George. So, Bernard takes Juliet to a secret room filled with surveillance equipment and had his men play the footage of George before his death. It turned out George wasn't murdered. Instead, he had willingly jumped to his death to protect the hard drive. The question that had haunted Juliet for so long finally vanished in that instant. She accepted her fate of being sent out to clean. Soon, the staff suited Juliet up in a protective suit. At this moment, everyone in the silo had gathered in the cafeteria to watch. This was the largest crowd that had ever gathered for a cleaning. When Juliet reached the surface, the view was exactly the same as in the video. Blue skies, white clouds. The weather was clear and sunny. But she quickly realized something was wrong. The number of birds and their flight path were identical to the ones in the video. It was then that Juliet realized this was all a virtual image. But what the people in the silo saw through the screen was a desolate wasteland. Then, under the horrified gaze of the crowd, Juliet walked up to the camera, but she didn't do what everyone else had done. Instead of wiping the camera, she dropped the wool cloth on the ground. Then, she turned and walked toward a distant hill. Seeing this, Bernard seemed to realize something. He quickly left the cafeteria and went to the silo's control room. He shut off the virtual display inside Juliet's helmet. As the beautiful world vanished, Juliet was instantly plunged into confusion. All she could see beyond the hill was a barren wasteland and a ruined city. Countless other craters appeared before her. Clearly, beneath those countless craters were other, identical doomsday silos. Juliet had no idea if the world she was seeing now was even real. She was lonely and in despair, with no idea what to do next. And that's where the first season of Silo ends.